Hey, Spookies. I know it looks like I'm about to head out, but full disclosure, I'm just wearing this jacket to look cool. So in today's episode, I wanted to talk about something that people don't really talk about a lot, and that's failure. I was invited to this Unicorn Writers Conference. It's not for unicorns, it's for writers. It was at a castle in New York, and it was really cool. The reason they asked me to come is because I was going to do a talk on illustrating in novels, because in Happy Face, Wintertown, all of my books, I tend to use art. I had the 3 examples to go off of, but I also had a long list of other projects that did not become books that I also used art in. So what followed was about an hour and a half of me listing off failure after failure after failure, all these different projects that I tried to get off the ground that all involved art. But the speech very well could have been called, the long list of Stephen Emon's failures. As far as I know, it's something that everybody goes through. I mean, it's possible that all these other authors that get on the bookshelves that always have different books coming out, different movie deals, it's possible everything they write turns to gold. I don't know. For me, not the case. I have a lot of things that I love, that I'm passionate about, that don't get off the ground, and people don't really talk about it. So let's talk about it. Alright, so today's video I wanted to talk about failures, creative failures. Although I think with every failure there's success, so it's definitely a dichotomy. If you have one, you have the other. I started doing artwork in an attempt to be published back in the late 90s. I did a comic strip for quite a few years called Steve-erino, and I did that for like 97, 98, 99, up into the early 2000s, pretty much until Emo Boy came out. Now, I never became a published syndicated cartoonist, so you could say Steve-erino was my first major failure. But over those 5 years or so, I learned so much. I sent out so many different submissions to syndicates. I got to know editors there. I won some contests. My art developed. My writing developed. So in a lot of ways, you could say that was a success. Likewise with Emo Boy, sales kind of dwindled by the time I got to 12 issues. We couldn't publish it anymore, but I further established my writing, and out of that came my young adult career, and I got to write an Emo Boy movie. After that, I was working in young adult novels, and I did Happy Face, I did Wintertown, but even that came with a lot of failures along the way. After I finished Happy Face, I wanted to do a science fiction novel. It's actually the earliest incarnation of the webcomic that I'm going to be doing really soon. And that was something that I spent a lot of time on. I was reading about quantum mechanic theory and figuring out the afterworld and trying to come up with a take on the Odyssey. And it was something that I was just spinning my wheels on. I was just doing all this research and all this writing, but I wasn't getting any further with my story. And eventually I had the idea for Wintertown when I saw the name Winter Haven, Florida. And I thought, Winter Haven, we should have a Winter Haven in Connecticut. We have winter here. It was that simple. So I ended up publishing my next book off of something that was literally a 2-second thought. Even when I did Bright Lights, Dark Nights as my 3rd book, there was a good year or so that I was pushing a ghost story that took place in the woods. I was trying to do a young adult story about a band where all the members were in love with the same girl. And eventually Bright Lights, Dark Nights came out. We had that hook of, let's take a look at a interracial relationship for teenagers in the mid 2010s, and that was an interesting enough hook that we could kind of develop a full book around that. Now the years since Bright Lights, Dark Nights have been a little tougher. I spent a good year or so working on a Civil War themed young adult novel, even though my grandmother really wanted me to write this story. She had this newspaper article about her grandfather and how he was the youngest person to survive the entirety of the war, and it had this kind of romance to it, and married his sweetie right after, and she thought it would be a good book to write. Now, I am not a good history student. I regularly failed history. It's one of those things where if you fail it one semester, it's kind of hard to catch up. Not my strong suit, so I never really wanted to do it, but I mentioned it to my editor and to my agent, and everybody was really interested in it. Now, what got me into that idea was, in my research, I came across the idea of these war sketchers, how photography was in its infancy at the time. You basically had this gigantic trailer that you had to take around with you just to take a picture. So they were still employing people to go out along with the armies into the war, and they would just kind of hide away and they would draw what they were seeing. And there's books of just this beautiful, beautiful art, and I was really excited about that. I wanted to draw these kind of Virginia landscapes and rolling clouds, and I spent a good year doing as much research as I could. I was reading everything about it. I was tracking exactly where my great-great-grandfather had gone. We sent it out, and my editor was like, it's clear that he doesn't really know this time period enough to write this story. It was extremely difficult. Almost every other sentence I had to look up, was this a thing in the 1860s? I tried doing something that was a spin-off of Bright Lights, Dark Nights, because I got so much nice fan mail about that and about how I wrote that Naomi character. So I tried creating something in that same world. It was more superhero oriented, but it was about a black female lead, and I think that was just too many jumps trying to write somebody a different race and a different sex of my own. I was working on a book about a traveling musician. He had this thing where he would fake kill himself at the end of every one of his shows. That one I tried putting out there, and I got feedback that, having a teen protagonist that doesn't live at home or have a regular school or whatever wasn't identifiable enough. So that was something that I worked on for a while, just to kind of come up with a dead end on that. And it's tough because when you spend a few months working on something and you invest so much of yourself and you take things from your life and you fall in love with these characters just to kind of get this, no, we're not going to publish that, or I don't think this is the one, Steve. Maybe keep trying. It's very difficult, but with time and space, you look back on it and you go, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have been working on that, or, yeah, maybe I could have done that different. Most of the times, current me can respect that decision and say, yeah, there's probably a reason why that one didn't work out. The thing is, though, is that even when I spend a year working on something and it doesn't happen, it's not for nothing. That thing I was working on in 2010, that really kind of bloated sci-fi epic involving, how to use quantum mechanic theory to get into an afterlife. Eventually I thought maybe it's not a science fiction story, maybe it's a ghost story. Maybe it's a much more supernatural, abstract way of getting from A to B. Maybe it's not something I need to do all of this crazy research and science to accomplish. A lot of the work that I do, even if it doesn't happen right then, could happen later. And sometimes you start a couple different projects and then you put them together and you think, oh, this is the missing puzzle piece. This is what I needed. I just wasn't ready to write it at that time. And so there's going to be perceived failures, but there's going to be successes. And a lot of times they're successes that maybe you didn't plan on and they just happen. When I did Bright Lights, Dark Nights, it was originally going to be about bullies and about comic books, and it was going to have this entire comic book motif, and it was going to look like a Spider-Man comic from the 1960s, and it just happened to have an interracial romance in it. In that process, we kind of decided there's two stories being told here, and one of them is a lot more interesting than the other, which doesn't mean that all that comic book stuff that I was really kind of geeking out about and looking forward to doing won't happen. That's probably just a different project that I haven't gotten to yet. Just because something doesn't work right now doesn't mean it'll never work. Just learn from it, use it as an experience. I think I've gained something from every one of these projects that I worked on, whether they got published or not. So a lot of this stuff that I've done, really nobody has seen, but I kind of consider them all part of my story in publishing and in my creative life. You are not your failures. You are not your rejections. You are not your quitting. You are not your unfinished projects. Those are just steps on your journey. That's not your story. That's not the end. It's just part of the process. And it's something, as far as I know, everybody goes through. So learn from it, hold your head up high, move on, hit the like button, subscribe to the videos, and leave a comment. Why not? Let's talk about your failures. And next week I want to talk about writing horror, spooky stories. That's what I'm really into right now, and I'm excited to get into it. Stay tuned and stay spooky.
Stay spooky.